On the night of April 26, 1986, something happened in northern Ukraine that almost no one understood while it was happening. A distant glow appeared on the horizon past midnight. People in a city called Pripyat walked out onto their balconies and watched the sky turn strange colors. Parents held their children up to see the mysterious light. No one screamed, no one ran. They just stood there, curious, because the human brain does not panic over things it cannot name. What they were watching was the aftermath of the worst nuclear disaster in human history. A reactor explosion that had just released radioactive material equal to 500 Hiroshima bombs into the night air above their heads. But they didn't know that. The city's phone lines had been cut. Plant workers were forbidden from telling their families what happened. So 49,000 people went to sleep that night, breathing radioactive air. Pripyat was supposed to be a showcase, a perfect Soviet city where children played in playgrounds surrounded by rose bushes. The people who lived there trusted their government. On April 27, 1986, they were given 50 minutes to pack and leave. They were told it would be 3 days. It has been 40 years. This is Pripyat, the town left behind. And this is what they didn't tell you. It is 1:23 a.m. on Saturday, April 26, 1986, and inside reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, operators are conducting a safety test. They are simulating a power outage to see if the turbine's energy can keep emergency systems running until backup generators kick in. It is routine. It has been done before. But tonight, something goes catastrophically wrong. A power surge triggers a steam explosion so violent it blows the 1,000-ton biological shield off the top of the reactor like a bottle cap. Seconds later, a second explosion destroys the reactor core entirely, hurling burning chunks of graphite and nuclear fuel into the night sky. Approximately 50 million curies of radioactive material begin pouring into the atmosphere. But 3 kilometers away, in the city of Pripyat, almost no one hears it. What people in Pripyat see is not an explosion. It is a glow, a strange, shifting light on the horizon where the power plant sits. Some people notice it from their apartment windows. Others step out onto balconies to get a better look. A few families walk to the railway bridge that offers a clear view toward the plant. Children are lifted onto shoulders. Couples hold hands and watch the sky. There is no panic, no sirens, no loudspeakers telling them to go inside. Just curiosity and the faint, unspoken sense that something is wrong. But no one knows what, and no one is saying. Firefighters from Pripyat Station Number 2 arrive at the plant within minutes of the explosion. Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik and Lieutenant Viktor Kibanok lead their crews onto the roof to fight the blaze, unaware they are standing in radiation fields exceeding 1,000 roentgens per hour, a lethal dose absorbed in under a minute. They are not told. They are not given protective equipment beyond their standard firefighting gear. Within weeks, Pravik, Kibanok, and 28 of their fellow first responders will be dead from acute radiation syndrome, their bodies so irradiated they are buried in zinc-lined coffins sealed with concrete. Here is the detail that makes this moment unbearable in hindsight. The people watching from the bridge, from their balconies, from the streets, they were not stupid. They were doing exactly what any human being would do when confronted with something strange and unexplained. They were trying to understand it, and the reason they could not understand it is because the danger was invisible. Radiation has no color. It has no smell. It makes no sound. You can stand in a lethal radiation field and feel absolutely nothing. The glow on the horizon faded by morning, and when the sun rose over Pripyat on April 26, 1986, the city looked almost exactly as it had the day before. But everything had already changed. The invisible had already settled into the air, the soil, the water. To understand why they trusted so completely, you have to understand what Pripyat was. On February 4, 1970, Soviet authorities broke ground on a new kind of city in the marshy flatlands of northern Ukraine. They called it Pripyat, after the river that snaked through the birch forests nearby, and they designed it as something extraordinary, a closed nuclear city built under the slogan "Myrny Atom," the peaceful atom. Pripyat was not just a place to live, it was a showcase of Soviet modernity, a utopia for the atomic age, a city that would prove to the world that nuclear energy was not a weapon, but a tool for human progress. And by January 1st, 1986, just months before the disaster, Pripyat had become exactly what its planners dreamed it would be. Pripyat was young. The average age of its 49,360 residents was just 26 years old. It was a city of newlyweds, young families, engineers, teachers, and scientists who had been recruited from across the Soviet Union to work at the Chernobyl plant and build a future together. The city hummed with life. There were 160 apartment blocks containing 13,414 apartments. 15 kindergartens and elementary schools served 4,980 children. 5 secondary schools educated 6,786 students. There was a hospital with 410 beds, 25 stores and shopping malls, 27 cafes and restaurants, 10 gyms, 3 indoor swimming pools, including the gleaming Azure Pool, 2 stadiums, and the Grand Palace of Culture Energetic. And at the edge of town, ready to open on May 1st, 1986, stood a brand new amusement park with a yellow Ferris wheel that would never carry a single rider. Pripyat was built with extraordinary speed and ambition. Within 16 years, Soviet planners had transformed empty marshland into a functioning modern city with infrastructure that many older Soviet cities lacked. Residents enjoyed higher salaries than average Soviet workers, access to imported goods unavailable elsewhere, and a quality of life that made Pripyat one of the most desirable places to live in Ukraine. The people of Pripyat were proud of their city. They believed they were part of something important: the future of energy, the future of the Soviet Union, the future itself. And they had every reason to believe that future was safe. Here is the truth about Pripyat that makes everything that follows so much harder to accept. The people who lived there were not naive. They were educated. Many of them were engineers, physicists, and technicians who worked directly at the Chernobyl plant and understood how nuclear reactors functioned. But they trusted the system. They trusted that safety protocols were in place. They trusted that if something went wrong, they would be told. That trust, rational, earned, and deeply human, is what made the disaster so devastating. Pripyat was built to prove that nuclear energy was the future. But inside reactor number 4, that future was about to explode. Nuclear energy works by splitting atoms, a process called fission, inside the core of a reactor. When uranium atoms are hit by neutrons, they split apart, releasing enormous amounts of heat and more neutrons, which split more atoms, creating a controlled chain reaction. That heat is used to boil water, which creates steam, which spins turbines, which generate electricity. It is elegant, it is efficient, and when it works correctly, it is extraordinarily safe. But the RBMK 1000 reactor design used at Chernobyl had a fatal flaw. Under certain low-power conditions, the reactor became unstable. The chain reaction could accelerate out of control in seconds. Soviet scientists knew about this flaw, but they did not fix it, and they did not tell the operators. On the night of April 25th, the operators in reactor number 4 were conducting a test that required them to reduce the reactor's power output to very low levels. They made mistakes, serious ones, violations of protocol that would later be used to blame them for the disaster. But the deeper truth is that the reactor itself was unstable by design, and the operators had not been trained to understand how dangerous the situation they were creating actually was. At 1:23:47 a.m. on April 26th, the chain reaction inside the core went supercritical. The heat spiked, the cooling water flashed to steam, and the reactor, which Soviet authorities had repeatedly declared could never explode, exploded. Twice. The first blast was steam. The second was far more powerful, and it destroyed the reactor core entirely, exposing the radioactive fuel to open air and sending a column of heat, smoke, and invisible death into the night sky above Pripyat. The explosion released approximately 50 million curies of radioactive material into the atmosphere, the equivalent of 500 Hiroshima bombs. The radioactive cloud carried isotopes of iodine 131, cesium 137, strontium 90, and plutonium 239, elements that would settle across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and eventually across Europe. On the roof of Reactor 3, where firefighters fought the blaze, radiation levels exceeded 1,000 roentgens per hour, a lethal dose absorbed in under 60 seconds. In Pripyat Central Square, 3 kilometers away, radiation levels climbed to 180, then 300, then approaching 600 near the plant by the next morning. But radiation is invisible. It has no color, no smell, no taste. Though some people reported a metallic flavor in the air. Here is what makes radiation so uniquely terrifying as a form of danger. With fire, you see flames. With poison gas, you smell it. With a collapsing building, you hear it. But radiation gives you nothing. No warning, no signal. By the time symptoms appear, nausea, vomiting, burns, hair loss, the damage is already done. The people of Pripyat, on the morning of April 26th, had no idea they were being exposed. Children played outside, families went for walks, a wedding party celebrated in the streets. Life continued, and the invisible settled into their lungs, their skin, their bones. Radiation had already blanketed Pripyat by the time the sun rose on April 26th. But the authorities who did know made a decision that would define the entire disaster. They chose not to tell the truth. At 5 a.m. on April 26, 1986, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev was awakened in Moscow and told that there had been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. He was told the reactor was intact. That was a lie. The reactor had been destroyed. But the Soviet system operated on a principle of denying bad news until it could no longer be denied. And so, for 36 hours, as radiation poured into the atmosphere and settled over Pripyat, the people living there were told almost nothing. Intercity phone lines had been severed. Plant workers were forbidden from sharing information with their families. Daily life in Pripyat continued as though nothing had happened, because no one in authority was willing to say out loud that something catastrophic had already occurred. On the morning of April 26th, children went to school, parents went to work, couples strolled through the parks, a wedding party posed for photographs in front of the Palace of Culture. But beneath that surface normalcy, something was deeply, invisibly wrong. People noticed a strange metallic taste in the air. Some felt nauseous. A few saw Soviet military vehicles moving through the streets, men in strange protective suits taking measurements with instruments no one recognized. But there were no announcements, no warnings, no instructions to stay indoors, to close windows, to stop children from playing outside. And so people did what human beings always do when authority is silent. They assumed everything was fine. They trusted the system. And every hour they spent outside, every breath they took, every glass of water they drank, the radiation dose inside their bodies climbed higher. Deputy Premier Boris Sherbina did not arrive in Pripyat until 8 p.m. on April 26th, a full 18 hours after the explosion. When he finally convened an emergency commission, 3 more explosions from the reactor sent red-hot debris arcing across the sky. Even then, the commission's senior medical officer refused to authorize an evacuation because the calculated daily intake was only 4.5 Röntgens, a number that ignored the vulnerability of children, pregnant women, and the elderly. It was close to midnight before nuclear physicist Armen Abagian convinced Sherbina to order the evacuation. Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov later recalled the call. Sherbina told me people in the city are living it up full blast. Weddings are going on. I decided evacuation tomorrow. Here is the most damning detail of the entire delayed response. The buses that would eventually evacuate Pripyat were already waiting. At 1:30 a.m. on April 27th, columns of 1,225 buses and 200 trucks had been moved into position. Their drivers sat idling for hours, absorbing dangerous radiation, waiting for an order that kept being delayed. The vehicles were ready. The plan was ready. But the decision to actually tell the people of Pripyat that they were in danger was postponed again and again, not because of logistics, but because of politics. For 36 hours, the people of Pripyat lived inside a radiation cloud and were never told. And then, at 1:10 p.m. on April 27th, the city's radio system crackled to life. At approximately 1:10 p.m. on April 27th, 1986, a full 36 hours after the explosion, the city's radio system crackled to life, and a woman's voice, speaking Russian with a Ukrainian accent, delivered the announcement that every resident of Pripyat would remember for the rest of their lives. Attention! Attention! In connection with the accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station, unfavorable radiation conditions are developing in the city of Pripyat. It has become necessary to carry out a temporary evacuation, beginning at 1400 hours. It is recommended that people take documents, absolutely necessary items, and food products to meet immediate needs. Please remain calm. Residents were given approximately 50 minutes to gather their things. They were told the evacuation would last 3 days, just 3 days, so they left winter clothes hanging in closets. They left family photographs on shelves. They left children's toys on beds, dishes drying beside sinks, books open on tables. They packed light because they believed they were coming back. By 2 p.m., the buses had begun loading. Families moved quickly, but without panic. This was temporary after all, just a precaution, just 3 days. Mothers carried small bags. Fathers held children. Elderly residents were helped onto buses by neighbors. But beneath the calm, there was confusion. Why now? Why so suddenly? And why, if this was just a precaution, were soldiers in protective suits standing at checkpoints with instruments that clicked louder the closer you got to the plant? No one had answers. The people in authority were simply repeating the same message. Temporary. 3 days, remain calm. By 4:30 p.m., the evacuation was complete. 47,000 people loaded onto buses in under 3 hours. It was the most rapid urban evacuation in modern history. And as the last buses pulled away, journalist Lyubov Kovalevska looked back at a city that was still standing, still lit, still running, but already dead. The 3 days became 40 years. A 10-kilometer exclusion zone was established immediately around the plant, and later expanded to 30 kilometers, ultimately evacuating over 350,000 people from surrounding villages and towns. The people of Pripyat were resettled in newly built apartment blocks across Ukraine, their lives uprooted, their community scattered. They were not allowed to return, not to retrieve belongings, not to visit graves, not even to say goodbye. The Soviet government declared Pripyat a closed zone. Here is the detail that haunts everyone who survived the evacuation. They trusted the announcement. If they had been told the truth, that they would never return, they would have made different choices. They would have grabbed family albums. They would have taken heirlooms. But they were lied to. And so they left lightly, casually, as though stepping out for a weekend trip. The buses carried 49,000 people out of Pripyat on April 27, 1986. And the city they left behind became something no one had anticipated. A time capsule. A city frozen in 1986, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Pripyat did not collapse. It was not bombed. It was not burned to the ground. It was simply abandoned. And in the years that followed the evacuation, the city remained almost perfectly preserved, not because anyone was maintaining it, but because no one was there to disturb it. The apartment blocks still stood. The schools still held their desks in rows. The hospital still had beds, cribs, and medical equipment scattered across its floors. And the amusement park, the yellow Ferris wheel, the bumper cars, the carnival rides that were supposed to open on May 1st, 1986, stood motionless against the sky, waiting for children who would never come. Pripyat became a ghost city, not a ruin. A pause, a moment frozen in time that never resumed. Walking through Pripyat today, if you are allowed into the exclusion zone, if you follow the strict safety protocols, is an experience that people describe in the same way. They say it feels like the people just left, and they did. Textbooks still sit open on school desks, as though the students were called away mid-lesson. Gas masks are scattered across gymnasium floors, left behind after a civil defense drill that was interrupted by the evacuation. Children's toys, dolls, wooden blocks, stuffed animals lie on beds in kindergartens, exactly where they were placed on the morning of April 27th. Plates are still drying beside sinks. Clothes still hang in closets. And in the central square, The Ferris wheel stands silent, its yellow paint fading, its cars swaying slightly in the wind, a monument to a celebration that never happened. Cesium-137, one of the primary radioactive isotopes released in the disaster, has a half-life of 30 years, meaning it will take at least 180 years for radiation levels to drop to background levels. And plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,000 years, meaning traces of Chernobyl's radiation will outlast every building, every monument, and every memory of the people who once lived there. But nature does not wait for radiation to decay. Within months of the evacuation, plants began growing through cracks in the pavement. Within years, trees were splitting through apartment walls. By 2026, Pripyat is a forest city. Birch trees growing through windows, vines covering Soviet murals, moss blanketing the Palace of Culture steps, and wildlife has returned. An April 2026 investigation documented a thriving ecosystem inside the exclusion zone. Wolves, wild boar, lynx, European bison, and over 200 species of birds now inhabit the area. The absence of humans allowed nature to reclaim what had been taken. Pripyat is not dead. It is alive, just not with the life it was built for. Pripyat is frozen in 1986. But the story it tells is not frozen. It is still unfolding. Because the disaster at Chernobyl was not just a failure of technology, it was a failure of systems, a failure of trust, a failure of the idea that authority will always protect the people it governs. And that failure, that deeper, systemic truth, is what makes Pripyat more than a ghost city. It makes it a warning. Pripyat was not destroyed by an explosion. It was destroyed by silence, by the decision to withhold the truth, by the system that chose control over safety. The disaster at Chernobyl killed 31 people in the immediate aftermath. But the delayed evacuation, the lack of warnings, the refusal to tell the truth, that killed thousands more. It erased an entire city from the map. But because the people in charge decided that protecting the state was more important than protecting the people who lived there, we think of disasters as moments. But Pripyat teaches us that the worst disasters are not the ones that happen in an instant. They are the ones that happen slowly, invisibly, while people go about their daily lives, unaware that the danger has already arrived. The explosion was a moment. The disaster is still unfolding. Somewhere in Ukraine today, a survivor of Pripyat is looking at photographs of a city that no longer exists and remembering the day they were told it would only be 3 days. Somewhere, the yellow Ferris wheel in Pripyat is still standing, motionless, waiting for a celebration that will never come. On the night of April 26, 1986, people in Pripyat saw a glow on the horizon and wondered what it was. They didn't know, they weren't told, and by the time the truth reached them, it was already too late. The most dangerous things are the ones you can't see, and the ones no one tells you about. Not just a nuclear disaster, a human story about trust, control, and invisible danger. About 49,000 people who were told they would return in 3 days and never came home. Pripyat is still there, but the people are not. And the lesson, the warning, is written in every abandoned classroom, every rusting amusement ride. The most dangerous things are the ones you can't see, and the ones no one tells you about. Subscribe for more untold stories Share this if it changed how you think about trust, because these warnings matter.